Good afternoon. Thank you for being with us here today. I'll just give a quick note about the event. The event is going to be in English, but there will be a simultaneous translation. And if you would like to listen to the event in Turkish, you should press on the interpretation button, and then you have to choose Turkish. Then you'll be listening to the event in Turkish. And we won't be using the chat option in this event. We'll be using the Q&A option. If you have questions during the talk, you can ask your questions in the Q&A section, and I'll be directing the questions to Dr. Haass. My name is Evren Balta, and I'm the director of the TÜSİAD Global Politics Forum, and I'll be moderating this event with Soli Özel from Kadir Has University. And as the Global Politics Forum, we would like to welcome to Dr. Haass, who will be speaking about American power in a post-pandemic world. Let me introduce Dr. Haass very briefly. He needs no introduction, but let me still do that. He is a veteran diplomat and currently the president of Council of Foreign Relations. He's the author of many influential books. Let me name some of them: Foreign Policy Begins at Home, War of Necessity and War of Choice, among many others. His most recent book, and I'll show you, The World, A Brief Introduction, came out in 2020 and became the New York Times bestseller. And it's used as a textbook all around the world in teaching global issues to college students. We are using it as a textbook in our university at Özyeğin as well. Dr. Haass, thank you so much for joining us here today. We have many questions and issues we would like to discuss with you. But let me start with a big question and then give you the floor. And you're probably the keenest observer of American power since decades. You're both an academic and practitioner serving in many influential positions. So my first question to you, and I think you're the right person to ask that, how has the American power transformed in the last decade or two? And how is this affecting how we make sense of politics in this world? And in a recent piece, you have argued that there is not much a rupture between President Trump and President Biden in terms of foreign policy, but more of a continuity. And it seems to me that you see American power more in a structural term, but yet the Biden administration has declared that there is a lot changing in terms of how America exercises its power. America is back. Is it back really? And if it is back to doing what? Thank you, and the floor is yours. For 10 to 12 minutes, you'll be giving your initial remarks, then we'll have some follow-up questions. Thank you.
No, thank you. It's good to be with you. I'm sorry only it's virtual. I would much prefer to be in Turkey. You left out the most important part of my background, which is that 40 years ago, I was the US official, I was the US envoy to the Cyprus problem. And I used to oversee US relations with Turkey, Greece, and Cyprus at the State Department. So that was the high watermark of my professional background. And one of the best parts of it is I got to know Turkey a bit, got a chance to go there a half dozen times a year for several years. And so in some ways, it was my first real responsibility as a US diplomat. Unfortunately, I didn't succeed. And I think Cyprus still remains divided. So on the other hand, I did not succeed in other places either. So it set the pattern for me. But again, it's very good to be with you all. You asked about American power over the last few decades. I think you have to talk about power in both absolute terms and relative terms. In absolute terms, with one possible caveat, American power has gotten greater. The American economy has grown. American innovation is impressive. The American military is objectively more powerful than it was. The one question about American power, because power is always a function, not just of capacity, but willingness to use it. And there, I think there's a big question mark. American willingness to use its power is less clear than it was for two reasons. One is we're more divided at home. You're obviously aware of that, given our politics. The most extreme manifestation of it came a year ago on January 6th of last year. But even beyond that, you see the divisions in our politics. And while all politics, whether Turkish politics, American politics, all politics have divisions, we've reached a degree of polarization that I think is uncharacteristic and is often dysfunctional. The other thing about American power that's worth talking about is that in many ways, certainly since George W. Bush, the 43rd president, I think there's been a slight decline or constraint on American willingness to use its power, particularly after Iraq and after the major buildup in Afghanistan. Historians will probably write about an American era of overreach, where we tried to do too much, particularly in those two countries. We tried to remake them in many ways. And we've also saw what happened in Libya under the Obama administration. And what we're seeing is, particularly in the greater Middle East, a reaction to overreach. And you can argue whether it's underreach, you can argue whether it's simply restraint. That's a different conversation. But in general, there's much less willingness for the United States to get heavily involved on the ground militarily in the part of the world that has dominated American foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. You had the Gulf War, you had the Iraq War, you had Afghanistan, Syria. I think that era of American foreign policy is over. So there's more reluctance to get involved there. So that has to do with American absolute power. American relative power, there it's a more complicated assessment. And what we've seen over the last few decades, which is what you asked me, Evren, is obviously the continued emergence of China. And China has much greater capacity economically, and it's beginning to translate that capacity into greater diplomatic activism, greater military strength. We have the Belt and Road Initiative, but also you've had much more assertive Chinese behavior in the South China Sea, more assertive behavior vis-a-vis Taiwan. Just the other day, you had a major incursion with Chinese aircraft. You've had the friction with its border with India, differences with Japan. And then at home, you've had a China which has become much more repressive, politically repressive, and the state role in the economy, rather than going down as many predicted or hoped for, has not happened. The state role in the economy has actually gone up. So what you see is the emergence of a much more capable China, and not the China people were hoping for. People were hoping that a China that joined the WTO 2 decades ago, a more integrated China, would become a more open China, a more liberal China, a China more willing to operate within the liberal world order. Just the opposites happen. So in that sense, the calculation of relative power has gotten more complicated because you have the emergence of China, and a very different kind of China than many anticipated. And then obviously, given the crisis of the moment, you have a Russia that is not more powerful in many ways. But what you have is a Russia that is willing to use the power it has. We've seen that in Georgia. We've seen that in Ukraine when they went into Crimea and the Donbass. We're seeing it now. We've seen it in Syria. Russia is a good example about how power, again, is a function not just of capability, but also of will. And Mr. Putin has a lot of will. He also has considerable power when it comes to conventional military forces, nuclear forces, cyber, energy. And what's interesting about Mr. Putin is he's willing to use these. And we can argue how wisely or not. That's a different conversation. But he is willing to act. So the United States now has to deal in a world. Here we are 3 decades after the end of the Cold War. And suddenly we live in a world of a revival of great power rivalry, which is a very familiar world. So this creates complications for the United States. Secondly, you have the rise of middle powers. And middle powers are everything from Iran, which seeks to be a dominant country in the Middle East, to North Korea, and even countries such as Turkey. You have middle powers who I would argue are both more capable and more assertive. And as the United States pulls back, particularly in the greater Middle East, these other countries are leaning forward. Again, Turkey and Iran are two good examples. So again, American power has to contend not just with the great powers of Russia and China, but with very capable, assertive middle powers in various regions of the world. And then lastly, American power has to contend with something we all have to contend with, which are global issues. And there's any number I could talk about, but two in particular. One is climate change. And there, the power of any single country to deal with a global challenge is limited. The nature of the challenge calls for collective action. And I would simply say COP26 that we just had in Glasgow. We're going to have COP27, I believe, in Egypt, the end of this year. I would simply say the performance of the world is disappointing and then some. So it's not a question of whether the United States is power. The real question is whether there's a collective willingness to act. And so far there isn't. And what's happening though is we're all vulnerable to the effects of climate change. So that's what we're seeing. The other area we've obviously seen it is COVID. And you mentioned, the post-COVID world. Well, we're not in a post-COVID world yet. I look forward to being in a post-COVID world, but we're still some ways away from that. We're still dealing with Omicron, and who knows about future variants. And I think what COVID shows, again, is the vulnerability of any country to infectious disease, the inadequacy, the shortcomings of the international global health machinery. It simply is not what it should be or needs to be. So the lesson I take from this is we are going to continue to be vulnerable here, both to the outbreak of disease, but we still don't have in place adequate arrangements for the production and distribution of vaccines. It's been really disappointing. So again, American power, shall we say, is not enough to cope with global issues. Global issues require collective response. No country, no matter how powerful it is, can deal with these things unilaterally. And I think that is in some ways the biggest reality of the modern world. So I'll just say one more thing and then I'll stop. So it's a very complicated moment in history. If you think about it, if you add up everything I've said, we've got a United States that's more divided at home and a little bit more suspicious of certain kinds of international involvement. You've got the return of great power rivalry. You've got the emergence of middle powers, and you have a number of global issues where the global response is inadequate, is insufficient to meet the challenge. So what this adds up to, this is a very difficult world for the United States. It's also a very difficult world for everybody else. It's a very difficult world for Russia. It's a difficult world for China, for Turkey, for Iran, for North Korea, because global as well as regional arrangements to promote order, again, are in many cases inadequate. So this is I suppose you could say it's an interesting time in history. I actually also think it's a worrisome time in history. It's a dangerous time in history, because we're seeing a lot of geopolitics, and we're also seeing, as a result, turbulence in the world of economics, where economics affects politics and politics affects economics. So that's where we are. I'll stop there. In Washington, there's the tradition of filibusters where people speak at great length. Since I'm in New York and not in Washington, I will not filibuster you all.
Thank you so much. That was great. I mean, we do have a lot of follow-up questions, but maybe Soli should go first and ask the first follow-up question. Go on.
Thank you. I'm kind of perplexed that you believe the American power expanded. From where I look at it, you used to have a two-war doctrine that you can no longer afford. The soft power of the United States has been reduced. The Iraq war has turned out to be quite a disaster in a variety of ways. You yourself has been very critical, if I remember correctly, about the way you left Afghanistan, and you weren't even in favor of leaving Afghanistan. Not to mention the fact that the oldest democracy in the world was actually faced with a coup attempt by its own president last year. It seems to me that those are really issues that would diminish America's power, no matter how big the economy might be today. And I'm not suggesting that the American decline is precipitous, and it is an absolute one. But how does the United States deal with the rest of the world under those the perception may be worse than reality. I'm not disputing that. So let's come to a concrete example. What about Ukraine, for instance? And I'll insert Turkey there as well. At some point, you did say you questioned whether or not Turkey was an ally. And part of it was about Turkish democracy, but there is Poland and Hungary we can compete with. But is Germany really an ally, for instance, in dealing with the Ukraine crisis? But it's a whole bundle, so pick whatever you want.
Look, I don't think we disagree in what you said. What I try to say is America has gotten objectively stronger in terms of its economy, in terms of its military, but we have less consensus or will to use it in many cases. You're right. The example of our democracy is, shall we say, much diminished. And in many cases, what we've done or haven't done has again hurt our relative position. And the rise of other countries, great powers and medium powers, has similarly hurt our relative position. So I don't think we're disagreeing. My point is simply that it's a good reminder that what matters is not simply measures of GDP or measures of the order of battle of a military. What matters in many cases, just as much or more, is the consensus in a country and its willingness to act with whatever capacity it has.
In fact, you said that foreign policy begins at home. That's one of your titles.
Yeah, it is true. I have to remind people, by the way, it was Mr. Donald Trump when he once wrote me about how much he liked that book. And I had to remind him that foreign policy begins at home, but it doesn't end there. So if I ever issue a new edition of that book, I might change the subtitle. You asked about Ukraine. I actually think the Biden administration has done well on Ukraine. I was very critical, as you say, of Afghanistan. I believe we could and should have stayed at a cost that was commensurate with the benefits and with the interests. I believe we made a mistake in leaving. I was critical both of the Trump administration for signing the February 2020 agreement with the Taliban and the Biden administration for implementing it. I thought that was a mistake. Obviously, how we left was messy and extremely unfortunate. But I think Ukraine has gone very well. The administration has done 4 things, at least maybe more than that. But one, it has increased its military and support and other forms of support for Ukraine, but not direct American military intervention. I think that's exactly the right mix. So it can't stop a Russian invasion, but it can raise the costs of an invasion and would certainly raise the costs of any occupation. Secondly, we've made clear that we would strengthen NATO, and that if Mr. Putin were to invade Ukraine, one of the prices he would pay, in addition to resistance in Ukraine, would be that there would be more NATO forces closer to his borders. Thirdly, there would be economic sanctions against Russia. Fourthly, we're now talking about ways of reducing European energy dependence on Russia, which is good. But all of this also involves a diplomatic option for Mr. Putin if he wishes to avail himself of it. The purpose of this is not to foreclose a diplomatic arrangement. So it's both to raise the costs of Mr. Putin intervening militarily or with cyber. It's to, by doing that, to enhance deterrence, but also to give him a way out if he wants it. Now, he's going to have to decide. He's manufactured this crisis for the most part. No one was about to bring Ukraine into NATO. I don't believe, I don't see that on the agenda anytime soon whatsoever. We can argue whether it ever should have been on the agenda at all. The decision at Bucharest in 2008, I do not agree with. So I think we made a mistake to start going down this road. That's a different issue. As somebody once said, we are where we are. But again, Mr. Putin seemed to have woken up a few months ago and decided he was going to try to deal with this. It wasn't because a lot had changed objectively. So one has to think it was more he saw either some opportunity for doing it. My own hunch is he actually misread the opportunity. I think he looked at everything you said, Soli. He looked at our domestic divisions. He looked at Afghanistan. It's quite possible that Mr. Putin saw an opportunity here that didn't exist. He may have actually misread the United States and Europe. You asked about Germany. Look, I'd say two things. One is on Germany. Yeah, its behavior has been disappointing. It has a very different view of Russia for all sorts of reasons, partially because of energy dependence, partially because of history. I think the decision by the previous German chancellor and government to phase out nuclear power was a strategic error. It was bad in terms of climate, and it was bad in terms of strategy, in terms of dependence on Russia, extremely unfortunate. But I see no signs that's going to be reversed. But again, but yes, I think it's a reminder that we're not on the same page in terms of the use of military force, in terms of relations with Russia. So Germany's an ally, but look, as it was during the Cold War. I mentioned before, 40 years ago, I was working on Turkey. I was in the European Bureau at the State Department. I remember how much time we spent dealing with differences between the United States and West Germany at the time over how to manage relations with the Soviet Union. Real questions over missile deployments and arms control policies. And that there was always friction where you had Germany often wanted a more conciliatory relationship with the Soviet Union than the United States was comfortable with. So this to me is not fundamentally new. I almost feel like I've seen this movie before. It's coming out now. It's unfortunate. And I think Mr. Putin sees it too. It's one of the reasons that it's quite possible he will, if he acts, do something that's not an all-out invasion. That way he avoids the most draconian responses. And he probably perceives that Germany is not on the same page as the United States. He knows that. And it might be a way to drive something of a wedge between Germany and some of its neighbors, and between Germany and the United States. The other thing I'd say, by the way, that's interesting about the crisis is Mr. Putin has taken some steps to reduce Russian vulnerability to sanctions. He's amassed a large reserve of dollars. The high oil price has given him a cushion. So I think the strength of the sanctions tool or instrument is somewhat weaker because, again, Germany and some Europeans are not in agreement to use it, and Russia's made itself more resistant. But all things being equal, I think, again, the Biden administration has handled this quite well in terms of alliance management. Also, we're at a time, we talked about the domestic division in the United States. On this issue, we're not that divided. I actually see more consensus than disagreement between Republicans and Democrats on this issue when I look at Washington. I'm not sure in the rest of the country, though, this is a big issue. I don't think most Americans get up in the morning and this is their first issue of concern. I think they're much more worried about inflation. They're much more worried about crime in our cities. In that sense, a former Speaker of the House of Representatives once said that all politics is local. And I think for a lot of Americans, the most pressing issues are domestic. Again, questions of COVID, questions of inflation, questions of physical safety, crime. I don't think foreign policy, whether it's Ukraine or anything else, is upmost in their minds. But that also gives the president a lot of freedom to act. As you know, under our Constitution, under our tradition, presidents enjoy a lot of leeway, a lot of discretion when it comes to foreign policy. That's true here. Plus, again, I think he enjoys quite a lot of bipartisan support in the Congress.
There are a lot of follow-up questions from the audience to what you just explained to us, American alliance patterns and this and that. And the questions is about the future of the transatlantic alliance, the EU-US cooperation. And we do know that the strategic autonomy concept, even for Turkey, but including the EU, has become the buzzword. And it means, and it refers to this idea that being strategically autonomous from US interests, US policies, however you define. So the question from Ümit Boyner, from some other, people from the audience is that, how do you see the future of NATO, for example, future of transatlantic alliance, the role of Turkey in the transatlantic alliance or in NATO?
I'm not a great believer in strategic autonomy for Europe. It may be a buzzword, but it's not a serious phrase. First of all, one can't think about Europe as a single collective geopolitical entity when it comes to foreign and defense policy. It's simply not. I mean, it's not simply that what we were just talking about. There's different points of view, but look at European defense spending. If you add up all of European defense spending, it's an extraordinarily large number. The problem is every country has its own national defense budget. And there's tremendous areas of overlap. There's not specialization. So Europe may spend, choose a number, $200 billion on defense, but you don't get, the result is not $200 billion worth of defense capability, because so much of the money is spent nationally, and it's not spent strategically as Europe. So I actually wish there were more of a European approach to foreign and defense policy. They're simply not. And I don't see it emerging. And this is fundamentally, Europe's now too large and diverse. The views of those who are close to Russia are different than the views of those who are not. There's also tremendous political range between the illiberalness of Hungary, some of Poland, and say Turkey, and some of the other countries. So Europe is very different politically, very different in strategic outlook, very different in capabilities. The willingness to spend money on defense is different. There isn't a collective defense effort. So I don't take it seriously, sorry. I don't take this idea of strategic autonomy. And that's not, by the way, an anti-European comment. That's just an observation of someone who's lived in Europe and worked with Europe now for, I'm sorry to say, half a century. It's a sign I'm getting old.
That mean,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Does that mean, therefore, that the United States commitment to be the provider of security to Europe will continue? What does that do to your commitments to shift towards Indo-Pacific?
It's a good question. Look, I think the United States, I think what this crisis shows with Ukraine is the United States is still able and willing to be committed to Europe, to its security. I think, though, it also highlights, and you raise a really good question, and we need to have a debate in this country. I think at the moment, if you add up the Russian challenge to order in Europe, the Chinese challenge to order in the Indo-Pacific, the Iranian challenge to order in the greater Middle East, the North Korean challenge in Northeast Asia, we have more challenges than we have capabilities. We have something of a strategic mismatch. Now, this has always been true to some extent. Again, for 50 years or more, we've had conversations about two-war strategies. What would happen if there were a crisis here and a crisis there at the same time? I used to work in the Pentagon. I remember working on these issues. But now, again, because of where we began this conversation this afternoon, because you have two major powers as well as a number of medium powers The world has become a place of much more distributed capability. And the demands on a country like the United States that has global interests have never been greater, I would argue. So right now, there is a growing mismatch between objective competition or threats to American interests and our ability to respond, certainly to our ability to respond simultaneously. We do not have, so we need to have an important ourselves strategic conversation. But I do think this crisis shows how committed the United States is to Europe. Also, it's increasingly hard to distinguish between our interests in Europe as a geographic issue and our interests in coordination with Europe as a global issue. Take the question of China. We need European support if we are going to have a successful policy against China. Just like the threat of sanctions to Mr. Putin is a component of our policy to deter him from invading Ukraine, we need European support to threaten sanctions against China to keep Mr. Xi from invading Taiwan. That, to me, is one of the essential tools of our Taiwan strategy, is European participation in it. We don't need European armed forces in Asia. Europe needs to help look after Europe geographically, but we need European participation in the economic instrument, in economic, in geoeconomic threats, if you will, to China. And I don't know if Europe will do that. And that, to me, is a big question for the transatlantic agenda. But again, I think this crisis shows that the U.S. remains committed to Europe. But I do think we're stretched, and I think that's an important, again, issue for us to, our military modernization and our planning has not kept up with, in some ways, I think, the changing realities, militarily, cyber, and other in the world.
Would you like to ask a follow-up question, Soli? Oh, okay. So the questions that are coming up from the audience is basically mostly on Turkish-American relations. For example, Doruk Samurai, citing what you have said in 2018, asks, you said technically an ally, but definitely not a partner, is asking about the future of Turkish-American relations. As for hundreds, sanctions, democracy, these are the issues that came up in the questions, and also obviously serious problems in the Turkish-American relations. And also some people from the audience asked whether Turkey can be a mediator or an ally in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, and if it changes something in Turkish-American relationship, bilateral relations. So the question is very broadly the future of Turkish-American relations.
Let me just deal with the second half of that first. Turkey cannot be a mediator. That would be actually a source, it'd be a major mistake. Because anytime an ally tries to mediate between, say, the United States and another great power, to the extent it opens up daylight between the United States and that country, it becomes a source of friction. We have a State Department, we have a national security process. We don't need others to do that. I think Turkey or anyone else should, if they have points of view, welcome to raise them. But I'm actually very uneasy about whether it's Mr. Macron or others going off, or the German government having an independent set of conversations with the Russians here. I think that's potentially a dangerous situation where the Russians begin to pick us off one by one and offer certain things to certain countries, and suddenly Western unity is no longer. So I don't think that would be helpful. In terms of the U.S.-Turkish relationship, I know my phrase, an ally but not a partner, seems to have some resonance. I think it's true. Ally is a formal definition, but partner is a qualitative measurement. And I think we have to acknowledge that this is a relationship that may have the legal form, but it doesn't have the substance. We haven't done many things together. There's not a great degree of trust. There's not a great degree of overlap in how we see things. Is that a permanent situation? I don't think so. It certainly doesn't need to be. So, the question is, could and would that change under the present Turkish government? That's a decision for the Turkish government to make. You would all be a better position to answer its willingness to do that. Look, quite honestly, we're talking about one individual. We're not talking about hundreds or thousands of individuals. You have a political system now where one individual has a large degree of discretion in terms of defining Turkish interests and how Turkey will pursue them. And whether it was the S-400 or policy in the Middle East or issues vis-a-vis immigrants, he is for support, for Hamas and other things. He's played his hand the way he's played it. Could he play his hand differently? Of course. And there's been stories just in the last 24 hours about a changing relationship with Hamas. So again, anytime you have an individual who has so much authority, the same individual who did certain things can do other things. And so that, so I actually think the reason U.S.-Turkish relations have evolved the way they have has less to do with changes in U.S. policy than it does with Turkish policy over the last decade or 15 years. We've been more reactive. You may disagree. Great, we can have the conversation. But I think we have largely been in a reactive mode. And Turkey has redefined its strategic thinking. So that we are where we are. So that could change under the present leadership. It may have to wait for subsequent leadership. It may be that Mr. Erdogan's successors, as part of their recalibration of Turkey's national interests, will take Turkish foreign policy in a somewhat different direction. In which case, I think, and if it moves it closer to certain areas of agreement with the United States, I think that would be welcome. Let me just sort of say, I don't know anyone who gets up in the morning who thinks this is ideal from the U.S. point of view, the current state of relations with Turkey. I don't know people who celebrate this. I think this is simply seen as an unfortunate fact of life, that the United States and Turkey have moved apart over recent years or decades. We don't see it as in our national interest, but we can't control it. I think it's been going on for several decades now, that we no longer have a degree of convergence. We probably haven't had it for 25 years. I remember when Prime Minister and then when Mr. Özel was in charge of your government, President, how close things were. And in the Gulf War, even in the aftermath, the difficult aftermath of the Gulf War. And I remember I was dispatched to Ankara to meet with them several times, and how close things were then. And we were able to work through, even when we had some differences, to work them out, because we were essentially wanted similar things. We had similar priorities. It hasn't been that way for several decades now. But again, I don't think anything about this is either desirable or permanent. But I do think that most of the change will have to come out of Ankara, because again, I think we're mostly in a reactive mode, and we've adjusted to some extent, but this is not ideal from our point of view. And I would think, I look forward to the day when people in Turkey conclude it's not ideal from Turkey's point of view.
Great, thanks. Soli, would you like to ask something?
Yeah, but don't you think the fact that the United States doesn't pay much attention to the concerns of its allies also has something to do with the way US relations with other allies, who are also partners in your estimation, also deteriorate from time to time? Don't you think it makes a difference that President Obama commits himself to a certain type of action if a certain red line is crossed and then reneges on it? Don't you think that creates a question of trust between partners and not just allies? So maybe as the Turkish side might have to reconsider, and I think that reconsideration is being done, that's what we read in the media or what we see in the media. Don't you think that maybe the United States would have to do the same as well, and not just for Turkey, but elsewhere too? And secondly, and this is the question I was dying to ask you, if, from my perspective, God forbid, in 2024, you have your former president back in power. Should we expect a massive change again in US policy, like withdrawing from JCPOA, from the Paris Agreement, talking about withdrawing from NATO? And don't you think this is really a very important factor that contributes to instability in the world order?
Well, essentially, you're asking the same question about American reliability and predictability. And what Mr. Obama did in Syria with the infamous red line, chemical weapons were used, the United States did not respond. We go into Libya under that administration, then there's no follow-up, so we help create a failed state. The previous administration abandoned the Kurds and others in the Middle East, signed the agreement in February 2020 with, which was essentially a withdrawal agreement with the Taliban. You had the unilateral departure by the United States from the JCPOA with Iran and others. You had the United States pulling out of the World Health Organization, the Paris climate process. Some of these issues have obviously been some of these policies have been reversed by the current administration. But I think this is really bad for the United States and it's really bad for the world. That I think that we have introduced, the fact that you have to ask this question is, to me, that's what's so distressing. I mean, for all of our differences during the Cold War, we were pretty consistent. And I think what's happened over the last, say, decade, plus or minus, is the range of foreign policy choices by the United States has become much larger. And we've introduced a large, and I think truly unfortunate dimension of unpredictability. So I'm not smart enough. I don't have the ability to see into the future about what's going to happen in 3 years in our politics. There's that American expression, a week is a lifetime in politics. Well, 3 years then is 156 lifetimes. I can't see that far. Too much is going on too quickly with our legal system, our political system. So anyone who predicts with any confidence what's going to be the political trajectory here for the next few years, I would simply ignore, because nobody knows. Nobody knows. But I think you raise a really serious question. And I think for other governments, part of their reality, like it or not, and this is true of allies, partners, adversaries, everybody else, is you now have to deal with the United States that is less predictable. And I think it's one of the reasons I write the kinds of things I do, that I'm concerned, I'd say, even pessimistic about the trajectory of the world, because the United States, for the most part, I would argue, has played a constructive role in promoting order in the world since World War II. And I see us less willing and able to do that, in part for the reason you mentioned, that we could have rotations of power, which is nothing new. It's great in a democracy to have rotations of power, but this degree of divergence and inconsistency of policy is something new. When you went from Truman to Eisenhower, or Eisenhower to Kennedy, and so forth, we didn't have this range. Or even from Reagan to Bush, even to Clinton, we didn't have these kinds of ranges. But now we have a much bigger range of outcomes, potential outcomes. And I think it will increase the temptation of adversaries and countries to act more recklessly. And I think it will cause allies and partners to think hard about their strategic options. And the fact now that we're having this conversation about strategic autonomy in Europe, whether you agree with me or not, about how real it is, but the fact that that conversation is happening is in some ways a reflection of this. The biggest change for a lot of European countries is their lack of confidence in the United States. And the fact that Mr. Trump was talking about pulling US troops out of Germany, was very close to Mr. Putin, and so forth, raised questions, fundamental questions about American fidelity to the Atlantic Alliance. So yes, we have introduced an unfortunate degree of uncertainty into these relationships. And again, the conversation about autonomy, I think you'll have conversations about greater capability in some countries. Should we build greater capability in order to substitute for the United States? And others will say, we don't want to do that. What we want to do, therefore, is somehow get closer to our potential adversaries. And what we want to do is not increase our capabilities. Instead, we will choose to decrease our threats. And I think you could see that in some other countries. I think either, yeah. So I think we are potentially setting in motion some far-reaching changes. And again, your question to me is a reflection of that reality.
There is a follow-up question from the audience to the same topic from Özgür Özdamar, and he asks about the Turkish public's increasingly anti-US foreign policy attitude. And he says every year about 10% more is added to people who disapprove of US as an ally in Turkey, and mostly because of the US alliance with YPG. And he says, and he asks, given your faith in all foreign policy begins at home, how do you expect that any governmental change in Turkey will change US-Turkish relations, given that now the public is pretty much anti-American and has this anti-US attitude?
Look, the United States and Turkey have managed differences over Kurdish issues for years. The United States is not supporting a Kurdish state. We have our relationship with what's going on in the Middle East. But Turkey and the United States also have a range of issues. We have a range of other concerns. So I think this is not the totality of US-Turkish relations. We will find hopefully other things. Look, we will find other things to agree about. And part of a relationship, part of a close relationship, alliance, partnership, whatever you call it, is you find areas to agree on, and you learn to manage your disagreements. The United States and Israel have had a really close, intimate relationship. Trust me, there have been powerful disagreements over issues of dealing with the Palestinians, over settlements, and so forth. Yet the relationship remains robust. So the goal of the US-Turkish relationship cannot realistically be to somehow eliminate disagreements. There'll always be disagreements over Cyprus, over the Kurds, over a number of other issues. Turkey's going to have elements of an independent foreign policy that at times Turkey's going to want to do things we're going to disagree with. We're going to want to do things that Turkey's going to disagree with. But that's what makes an alliance or partnership is the ability to not let the inevitable areas of disagreement get in the way of cooperation where your interests actually do line up. And I think that's the challenge for the United States and Turkey. And that's what foreign policy is all about. I mean, Soli asked before about the United States and Germany. We have real disagreements with Germany. We did with the previous government. We probably more with this government. Okay, that's a fact of life. The question then is, given that, can we, in that area, at least reduce our disagreements? And we can't eliminate them. Germany's always going to have a different policy towards Russia than we are. And then the question is, okay, how do we, in some ways, compartmentalize that so it doesn't spill over and undermine the rest of the relationship? And that, to me, is a realistic, that's why God invented diplomats. That's what diplomats do. That is the challenge. That is the challenge, and that will be the challenge for U.S.-Turkish relations.
Soli, do you have a follow-up question?
I do have actually a different one, unless there are follow-up questions to this. You, of course, are the president of Council on Foreign Relations, and of course, you publish probably the most influential magazine on this field in the world. And we all learn a lot from your writers, and that which includes you. What is your view, if you have any, about JCPOA? You did mention at least 4 potential explosive points in the world: North Korea, Iran, Russia, China. Okay, on China, it's Taiwan. It's very difficult to call it Russia, we're seeing the Ukraine thing. And there are talks going on in Vienna, in fact, on revitalizing or resurrecting JCPOA. How likely is it? And what happens if there is no agreement? Because it does have repercussions for us as well.
I understand. It's hard to make predictions about what will happen, but let me suggest a few scenarios. Because quite honestly, I'm not privy to the immediate details of the talks. They've proven difficult so far. But it seems to me there's a couple of possible ways this could play out. Imagine you do have a successful outcome in Vienna and you get the two, and by success you mean the two countries essentially agree to comply with the JCPOA, either as was written 6 years ago or something close to it. I think that's unlikely, but it's possible. Okay, that stabilizes things when it comes to the nuclear competition. It has no impact whatsoever on Iran's missile capabilities, which are tremendous. There's no impact on Iran's subversion, support for groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, what it's doing in Yemen, what it's doing in the Gulf, and so forth. So, and it also only stabilizes things for a time. As you know, the JCPOA has limited durations before the so-called sunset provisions happen, before certain limits on centrifuges or uranium, the amount of enriched uranium Iran is allowed to possess, before those limits fade away. So it would basically create 5 to 10 years of stability in a narrow nuclear area. But that's all it would do. So we shouldn't kid ourselves that if we get to that point, it in any way solves the Iran problem. It doesn't. That's it's one of the many reasons I was not a big enthusiast for the original JCPOA. It was not an agreement I admired. But I think even getting to that point will prove difficult, in part because Iran has gone so far beyond that in terms of its nuclear capabilities. Also, I think there's no chance at all that the Biden administration could submit any new agreement with Iran to Congress and get it approved. No chance whatsoever. The JCPOA was done without congressional approval by the Obama administration, because there was no chance even then you could get congressional approval. Zero chance now. And that's not clear that will be enough, therefore, for Iran. Comes back to your earlier question, what about the future? If Iran makes certain commitments now, how does it know in 3 years you might not have a Republican president who would feel differently? So there's that. I think a more likely scenario, well, there's two other scenarios. One is the talks break down and there's no agreement at all. Iran continues to make moves towards a nuclear weapon and either goes all the way, tries to, or stops just before what people in my business call become a threshold nuclear country. The question is whether Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United States are prepared to live with that. And the question is whether that could spark a military action, new sanctions, or both. The third possibility, which I think is the most likely, is something in between, where the United States and Iran can't agree to the 2015 agreement, but have some informal understandings about what Iran can, what we're willing to accept or tolerate. It's not a new agreement, but they're informal understandings. To use a phrase you used before, Soli, red lines, and Iran agree it won't do certain things about enrichment or what have you. And possibly in exchange for that, there's a limited relaxation of some of the sanctions. It's what I call a something for something agreement. And I think that's probably the most, I could be wrong here, but anyhow, that's a third scenario. And again, it doesn't solve the problem, but it stabilizes the problem for a time. And anyhow, so there's various outcomes, diplomatic, formal, diplomatic, informal, or something that could be military. And I think we'll know pretty quickly. I think that, I don't think this will go on forever. I think that given how fast Iran has moved to increase its capabilities, I think sooner rather than later, sometime within the next year and a half, we'll probably know the answer to your question.
But can there not be a fourth scenario? First of all, this is not a bilateral negotiation. No. There are 6 parties apart from Iran. And I'm asking you, do China and Russia have any more toleration for a nuclear Iran than you would?
I don't think they want to see an Iran with the nuclear weapons either. I think you're exactly right, for various reasons. That they don't like proliferation, and they certainly don't like it so close to their territory. They're worried about also their own Muslim populations. But I think they might be more willing to live with an Iran that stops just short of it, potentially, than Israel or the United States would be. The so-called near nuclear or threshold nuclear option. My hunch is the Chinese and Russians would reluctantly live with that. And the question is whether others would as well. And I don't know the answer to that.
We don't have much time left. We only have 3 minutes, and there are too many questions, more than probably that you can respond in the remaining three minutes. But let me try to summarize them if I can. And questions from diplomats, academics, Namık Tan, Hasan Göç, Ahmet Üzümcü, İbrahim Mazlum, Ayşe Selçuk Esenbel, all the people that we really would like to give floor today, but unfortunately we cannot. And the questions is mostly about relationship of U.S. with China, this great power rivalry between China and the United States, and the limits of U.S. power, which you partially responded. But some of the questions are focusing on whether there is a possibility of cooperation, specifically in terms of climate change, and if so, how that cooperation is possible, and how climate change can become a bipartisan issue, and a global cooperation is possible around this theme. So this would be our last turn, probably, and the floor is yours. Or anything that you would like to add or comment, please.
Let me say 2 things here about China. Like, the U.S.-Chinese relationship will in many ways be the most important relationship of this era. I think the challenge will be, can we, the United States and China, avoid confrontation over Taiwan and other issues? Can we find ways to compete peacefully, have some types of economic involvement, even if not others? And can we even find ways for limited cooperation, whether it's on Afghanistan, North Korea, Iran, or conceivably climate? And that's the challenge. Again, it's a real challenge for foreign policy, because it's very hard to manage a relationship where you try to protect areas of cooperation in a larger context where you have this big disagreements. Very tough diplomatic challenge, but that's the challenge for the United States and China. I don't know if either side can manage this. That's an honest answer. I think Taiwan is the biggest question out there. I don't think it's an immediate question. This year in particular, you've got the Olympics, you've got the Party Congress, but it's a question about how we deter Chinese action. I don't think it's right to think of climate change as the principal area for U.S.-Chinese cooperation. What matters is less U.S.-Chinese cooperation than Chinese performance. Quite honestly, even if the United States and China can't cooperate on climate change, if China dramatically improves its performance, phasing out fossil fuels and so forth, that's the most they could do. That'd be fantastic for the global climate. If the United States improves its performance, that's great. If India does certain things or doesn't do other things. I think it's wrong, though, to think of this as largely a U.S.-Chinese bilateral issue. What's the problem the world faces is not a lack of U.S.-Chinese cooperation. More than anything, it faces a lack that China is not on a responsible trajectory. China is still increasing the amount of fossil fuels, particularly coal, it's using at home. Its emissions are going up. It is not on a responsible climate trajectory. So this is not an issue of cooperation. this is a question of Chinese priorities. And from everything I can see, China is much more concerned about economic growth than it is about a responsible climate policy. So the real issues are for China. And I think what the rest of the world has to do is point this out. And also what the United States and the EU did was very interesting, the steel agreement. What I believe we need to do is start using trade as a mechanism to promote climate goals. And basically say, you want to export a product into this area? Fine, but you're going to face tariffs. If this product, say, high tariffs if it's made with coal, maybe medium tariffs if it's made with oil or something else. That's what we need to do. One real problem is the United States does not have much of a trade policy. And it's an unfortunate area of bipartisan agreement. Both parties now have moved away from free trade. I think this is extraordinarily unfortunate, but that's where we are. But that to me is the way to think about this. How do we change Chinese performance rather than see this as a negotiating issue for the United States and China?
Great. Soli, would you like to say a couple of words?
No.
Thank you so much, Dr. Haass. I mean, thank you for accepting our invitation and being with us here today. This was an enlightening discussion. I really enjoyed it, learned a lot. Obviously, we have too many more, I mean, a lot of questions to ask you, but we unfortunately run out of time. So thank you again. Thanks for
joining us. We'll have to have you here in Istanbul then.
Hopefully.
I look forward to a return visit. It's been way too long because of COVID. So I much look forward to getting back and seeing so many of my friends. It would be great. Be a real treat. In the meantime, stay well, stay healthy, stay safe.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye-bye.